In this chapter, we're going to delve quite a bit more deeply into object-oriented programming. We covered the basics of object-oriented programming in Chapter 5, but we're going to go into much more detail in this chapter. And we're going to take it one step at a time. Each lesson will involve a single step in the object-oriented program design method. So the first thing we want to do is create a class definition. The class definition has to go outside of the main program. The beginning of the class definition begins with the keyword class, followed by the name of the class. The complete class definition has to go in curly braces, so we add those in next. In this lesson, we're going to only talk about the data members of a class, and remember that the data members are those pieces of data that you want to keep track of. So for example, for a time class, we want to keep track of, at the very minimum, the hours, the minutes, and the seconds. Although we might, ignore seconds for a time that doesn't need that kind of accuracy. For example, an appointment that's at 8:15, you don't need to know the seconds exactly. That's not important. When we keep track of data in a class, we have two possibilities for accessing that data. The data can be public or private. If we make the data public, remember public is a data access modifier. Let's take a look. When we declare the data of a class public, then we're saying that any part of any program has direct access to that data. Now, if you remember, one of the problems we have with having data be public is that, for example, with an integer value can be anything from -2 billion to +2 billion. So for example, if we create a class object like so, and we'll talk more about creating class objects with constructors in a future lesson. If we want to access public data, all we have to do is use the dot operator, and then those pieces of data become public, as you can see through IntelliSense. So I can set the hours to a legitimate hour. In a 24-hour time, that could be anywhere from 0 to 23. So I could set the time to be 12, and that's perfectly legitimate. But because hours is an integer, I could also set hours to -2000, and there's absolutely no problem with that from a data typing standpoint. The data type allows that absolutely. But from a logical standpoint, what does -2000 hours mean? Well, it doesn't make sense in a time standpoint. So having our data be public just won't do. One of the objectives of object-oriented programming is to have complete control over the data going into our class. Well, we can do that by writing set methods and properties that check closely the data coming in to make sure that it fits within the parameters that we want. In other words, an hour that fits in the range 0 to 23. So having public data probably is not a good idea. So the alternative is to declare the data members private, like that, with the private data access modifier. Now, if I try to access the data members directly using the dot operator, I can't do it. IntelliSense shows me what's available to the class, and it's certainly not one of these data members. If I try to set it, I get an error, and the error tells me hours is inaccessible due to its protection level. Well, its protection level is private, which means that I have to access the data somewhere within the definition of the class and not in the main program that uses the class. So that's our first lesson on object-oriented programming, working with data members and keeping the data members private. Later on in the chapter, I'll demonstrate how to write data validation routines when we want to set the value of a data member. But for now, the key lesson to remember is that the data members of our class need to be private. Now we're ready to move to the next lesson, where we're going to talk about building constructors. And constructors are used to instantiate objects of a class and are a very, very important part of object-oriented programming.